Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Tonight we are beginning the book of Exodus, and I'm so very excited about it. We've spent much of really the last year, since last summer, going through Genesis, and now this long historical narrative of really what are the Pentateuch, the five books of Moses, moves from the patriarchs, the story of a family, to the story of a nation, and particularly in Egypt. It switches gears because the book of Exodus reads a lot differently than the book of Genesis, frankly. Genesis focuses on sort of type scenes, like we see a lot of doublets in Genesis, sort of a repetition of key thematic elements like striving between the elder and the younger, and the seduction of for instance, of Judah. You've got the story of Rebekah and Isaac and Rachel and Jacob, and there's a lot of similarities there. When you get to the book of Exodus, it's really just one story. And Exodus, it operates think of it in two panels. The first 20 chapters are really narrative chapters. It's the story of how Israel gets out of Egypt. Beginning in chapter 21, it's the story of the giving of the law. Now you have to understand that in the Hebrew mind and conception, and therefore it really should be in ours as well, the story of the giving of the law, the giving of the law is a part of Israel's story. It's a part of our story. So that's why you don't simply have a separate book like here's the law. The law is given in a context, and as you know, context is everything. And we're told why that law is given, beginning in chapter 21. So you've got the book of Exodus begins with really a formal link back to the book of Genesis. Now, those of us who have a conservative view of the scripture believe what Jesus said, and that is that these are the books of Moses. When he would quote from the five books of the law, Jesus would say, as Moses said. And so I don't think that's merely a figure of speech. I think Moses really wrote this. He's the author of these books. I think Jesus verified that, and I'm going to stick with Jesus over modern literary and biblical critics. So I think there's a link here. And what is the link? Well, I hate to begin with sort of correcting the ESV because I love the English Standard Version. It's a great translation. And frankly, we need to read a modern translation because it's the language we speak. I grew up on the King James Version. I like the King James Version a lot because it's very, very literal. In fact, it's so literal that the typical English reader struggles with it. It fits in the Old Testament Hebrew grammatical construction, and the New Testament like Greek, and that's not the way we think and talk. So it's proper, I think, that we have a good modern translation. But whenever you translate something, it's impossible to do a word for word. It comes off sounding really strange to our ears because if you're a native English speaker, as I am, you hear it a certain way, and when other languages do something different, for instance, in English, you don't really start a sentence with the word and, let alone start a book with it. But you know, in the Old Testament, the first 13 books of the Bible all begin with the word and. Certainly Genesis, the move from Genesis to Exodus, there's an and here. It literally reads in verse 1 of Exodus 1, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. Interesting fact that in Hebrew, you name the book after really sort of the first substantive word in the book. And so the Hebrew name of the book of Exodus is the book of names because it begins. These are the names. Literally, it says, and these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And so that gives us a formal link. You have the word and that connects it to what came before. Also, you have that repetition We already had near in those final chapters of Genesis several times a listing of the sons of Jacob. And in fact, when they came up from Canaan, there was a census of them. And we're told that they numbered about 70. And you have that here, that they came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Then it lists them: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Hebrew would pronounce that Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. And Joseph was already in Egypt. So see how it links to what we already read in Genesis. Then Joseph died. All right, right there, all that whole Joseph story is dismissed in one line. We're not retold the story of Joseph. We're just told they came down because Joseph was already in the land of Egypt. That's how they got there. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. So now we have in this one sentence, it's like we're going to fast forward 400 years. All that generation has died. But the people of Israel, now again in the ESV that translates it, the people of Israel, but literally it says the sons of Israel. Now look back up at verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel. In that verse, as everywhere prior to that, when you have the phrase the sons of Israel, it's talking about the 12 sons of Jacob. Remember, Israel is Jacob. Now as we move into Exodus, it's a different referent. It's referring not to a family, it's referring to a nation. And from this point on, anytime you see the phrase B'nai Yisrael, the sons of Israel, we usually, King James translates that, the children of Israel, because it's not speaking only of those 12 sons, but of all the people in all 12 tribes and in all of Israel. They are the sons or the children of Israel. And verse 7 says the sons of Israel, the people of Israel, were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, now here's another connection back to Genesis. If you go all the way back to chapter 1 and verse 28, what's God's first commandment to Adam? Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. As you move through Genesis, remember, it's like the camera narrows down. It begins, it's the story of Adam and Eve and the whole human race. It narrows down, then we go through the flood and we get to Abraham. Abraham, one man in the whole world, but God appears to him and speaks to him, calls him into Canaan, reveals himself to him, and now it's the story of a family. And God promises Abraham that through Abraham, through his seed, that his seed are going to be like the stars in the sky, and they're going to be fruitful and multiply. So the command given to Adam as the son of God in Genesis 1 is fulfilled now through Abraham in his descendants. And this is again a picture of the blessing of God. So the narrative here is going to change. It's going to focus on this nation now, not merely the family or not an individual, although Moses is certainly going to be prominent. But now look at verse 8, this phrase, now there arose a new king over Egypt. Now immediately when we hear that phrase, it evokes a lot of things. It sounds like in English and in our culture, it sounds sort of like a folk tale. Now again, liberal critics say that's exactly what it is. But I obviously believe that this is a real story. I think it is historical, but it's told for a specific audience, and that audience are the people of God. And so notice that it uses the phrase king. Later we're going to hear this king of Egypt referred to as Pharaoh, which is the title that he has in Egypt. But here, when we're cueing the audience, The audience here, not Egyptians, but Israelites, and we are spiritual Israelites. This word king, it's like, okay, there's a new king. Immediately we know we've turned a page. This is a new chapter. And as the author Moses goes on, he's a king of Egypt who did not know Joseph. In Genesis, what's our view of the king of Egypt? It's very positive. He's the one that invites them down. He's the one that blesses Joseph and bestows on him an office and uses him and gives him great authority. But now in Exodus, this is a different king, a different Pharaoh. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't have a relationship. And this king is filled with resentment. Immediately, we're cued to expect something dark and ominous. And that's exactly what it is. He said to his people, oh, hear that phrase? His people are not Joseph's people. So the sons of Israel have lived now in the land of Goshen, and they've lived separately. They've not intermarried with the Egyptians. They've lived separately, and they are a separate nation within a nation. And Pharaoh addresses his people, separate from Joseph's people. Behold, the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, are too many and too mighty for us. Now, this is an interesting insight here, because really the story here, the early chapters of Exodus, is that Israel is fairly powerless. They're enslaved. They have no weaponry. They don't have an army. They can't fight. They're completely at the mercy of the Egyptians. And yet, Pharaoh sees them and says they're too many and too mighty. And this is one of several times in the books of Moses that we're going to see that the way others see the Israelites is very different than the way the Israelites see themselves. And here, they see themselves as enslaved and powerless, but Pharaoh sees them as a real threat. And he said, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. In other words, we got to be smart, or these guys are going to outnumber us. What you have here is what we will later call apartheid, where you have a minority ruling a majority. They're threatened by this country within a country, a nation within a nation. And so they have to oppress them to keep them from getting too powerful. So he said, let's deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So this is Pharaoh's not unreasonable fear that if someone comes against Egypt, that they might be able to rally the Israelites to their side, and then Egypt would have to fight a war without and within. And of course, that would be disastrous. Now, the Israelites have done nothing to arouse this suspicion. They've done nothing to provoke Pharaoh's fear, and yet Pharaoh is very, very afraid of them. And so he said, here's his solution. And this kind of solution never works. Verse 11, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. So they're slave labor. They put these taskmasters over them, and they force them to work. And that word's going to be very prominent here in a moment. Verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. Look at this. In verse 10, Pharaoh says, lest they multiply, we better do this. And now God answers Pharaoh by saying, you're afraid they're going to multiply? Oh yeah, they're going to multiply. And God blesses them, and he increases their number yet more, and they're taking up more and more of the land. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel, look at the word, work as slaves and made their lives bitter with, again, literally in Hebrew here, it says work in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. I don't know about you, but I sort of get the idea that they have to work a lot. How about that? Moses is clearly emphasizing this. This is what their lives are. I mean, initially, they were herdsmen and they were tending their livestock and their flocks, and they were doing it for the Pharaoh as well. But now they are oppressed. They're not allowed to tend to their needs. They're used as slave labor to build cities and to meet the needs of the Egyptians. They work. Then, verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now, several things here to notice. First of all, get the big picture, what's going on in the storyline. And the story is that these midwives are, whenever they will deliver children, the king of Egypt has ordered them to kill all the males. Brutal, but very effective technique to, first of all, strike fear into the hearts of the Hebrews, limit their population, and also the threat. You're not going to get an army of women really arising to fight the Egyptians. At least that's the thinking of the Pharaoh. So let's kill all the males. And I can't look at this without also thinking that in our culture, this is what we have done. The only thing we've changed is we've made it before the birth. It is completely legal in the United States. It is constitutionally protected according to the Supreme Court at this juncture, that a woman can find out the sex of her child before it is born, and she can exterminate the child. If she wants a boy, she can kill the female. In fact, the Center for Disease Control says that about 93% of all abortions that are performed for the purpose of a sex selection are females. In other words, people typically are they want a boy, and if they find out it's a girl, they exterminate her. Now that, I cannot think of anything more brutal, more ungodly, and further, more anti-woman than that. And yet, not a single secular women's organization will speak out against that. National Organization for Women, they believe in a woman's right to have an abortion for any reason whatsoever. This is as old as the book of Exodus, where humans have taken into their own abilities the right to exterminate babies. Pharaoh didn't know how to determine the sex of the child before birth, so he had to wait. With our modern technology, we've made it both legal and possible to do it much earlier than that. But I want you to know it's just as wrong for us today as it was then. It's just as wrong for girls as it was for boys, and it's just as wrong before birth as it was after birth. And clearly you have here something that flies in the face of God's view of the special nature of human life. God has created humanity in his own image. Here's the king of Egypt who is going to array himself against God, and you see it in his oppression of people and then in his disregard for human life, even among babies. So let's not miss that there is underlying the book of Exodus an ethic of the value of human life. The other thing I want you to notice is that it names two of the midwives. As far as I know, they're not mentioned anywhere else, only here. And yet, God, in his grace, saw fit to record the names of Shiphrah and Puah, because these are brave women who defy the law of the land, who defy the order and edict of the king, and spare the lives of these Hebrew children. It says in verse 17, the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. When is civil disobedience not only permissible but required for a believer? When the law goes directly against the law of God, and the law of God says that every human being is created in the image of God, and as an image bearer of the divinity, that child is worthy of respect and love and care. And these midwives defy the law in order to uphold God's law, which is higher. So they let the male children live. And so the other thing I want you to notice here is that you've got here a progression of the battle that God first informs us of in the fall. Remember, when Adam and Eve sinned, God told that there would be a seed of the woman who would bruise the head of the serpent, but the serpent would bruise his heel. And God is telling us that there's going to be a cosmic battle. Now, you and I know that cosmic battle goes throughout history up until the cross. Satan is defeated at the cross, and yet in his last gasp and with his army still free until the return of Christ, even though he's a defeated foe, he's doing all that he can to harm God's people and to keep others from hearing the gospel. He's, as Paul calls him, the God of this world. He's the prince of the power of the air. And what did he do? Up until the coming of the Messiah, his goal was to prevent the birth of the Messiah. And so what's he trying to do? He's trying to exterminate the seed of the woman. And this is an incredible picture of it. How does he move in the heart of Pharaoh? Kill the male children. The Messiah is going to be a male child, born of a woman, born of the descendants of Abraham. And so here you have Satan stirring up the heart of the king of Egypt to eradicate the seed of the woman. And of course, they don't do it. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So they play dumb. People ask all the time, is it ever wrong? Is it ever right, rather, to lie? I'm going to answer the question is no, because even in the necessity of lying here, and I would argue that in order to preserve human life, this is like war, like a lot of other things, that in order to preserve human life, I don't think they're under any obligation to tell Pharaoh the truth about them preserving life. Same way you see, remember, we see this in the story of Rahab and Joshua, that she says, when the king comes and says, are the spies here? She said, oh no, they were here, but they've already gone. And her first act of faith is to tell a lie. It's still, what I would argue, it's still a sin, because it's part of a fallen human world, and it's our fallen action in a fallen world. But it really is the lesser of two evils. Their choice here is to obey the king and to kill the males, or it's to spare them and then lie to the king about it. And they say, oh man, these Hebrew women, they're just popping those babies out. They're not like these Egyptian women who go into labor and struggle with it. I mean, before we get there, that child is born. They're vigorous women. So look at how God sees that. Verse 20, God dealt well with the midwives. He literally, it says, he gave them families. So he blessed them for their preservation of human life. Because the midwives feared God, back up verse 20, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. There it is again. You see multiplication. They're filling the earth. Pharaoh says, oh, lest they multiply. God says, oh, they're going to multiply. Here it is again. Everything Pharaoh does, it's backfiring, and he's not succeeding. So God blesses them. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, I want to just pause for a moment and point out another sort of major theme here, that the storyline of the book of Exodus really refers to three spaces, if you will. Think of it as three places, three arenas of action. One is in Egypt, and Egypt is connected with water. So, of course, when you think of Egypt, it's hard to not think of the Nile River. The Nile and the Nile Delta is what gives life to Egypt. In fact, it's so closely identified with the Nile that you can't separate the two. So water is in Egypt. It's the Nile. The water turns to blood. It's well watered. You see a lot about water in Egypt. Second space, of course, then is what we call the wilderness. It's specifically the wilderness of Sinai, the Negev, down in what is the southern part of Israel now, or the eastern part of Egypt. And that's dry, it's hot, it's desert. And when the Israelites will get out there, what's going to be their big problem? They don't have water. It's a place of such desert heat. It's also associated with fire, right? God's going to speak to Moses there on Sinai in a burning bush. When God speaks on Sinai, it's going to be covered with smoke and God's fiery presence. So you see in the wilderness, heat, dryness, flame, fire. The third space is only looked to, it's promised in Egypt. They don't get there in Egypt, but it is the land of Canaan. It's not a place of water. There, metaphorically, the rivers flow with what? Milk and honey. It is a place that is so incredible. God has so blessed it that it's the land of promise. It's the place where they long to go. So you see in Exodus, in these two panels, Egypt and then Sinai, but all of it is longing for Israel, the land flowing with milk and honey. So here you have the first strong reference to water in these first 20 chapters, and you're going to see a lot of references to water. When the Israelites leave, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to go through water. And ultimately, how will God destroy Pharaoh and his army? It will be with water. So a very, very important image. We don't want to miss that. That's going to be throughout. So Pharaoh says, all right, every child that's born to the Hebrews, throw it in the river, drown it. Now, I'm assuming you know sort of the rest of the storyline. If you've ever watched the Ten Commandments or read the book of Exodus, you know what I just told you, that Pharaoh himself is going to drown in water. Don't let the irony be lost on us. Now, the camera focuses in ever more tightly. So we've got the picture of the Israelites. The sons of Israel are now no longer just 12 sons and 70 people. Now they're a great nation, but they are a nation without a country. They're surrounded by Egyptians who treat them as enemies, though they've done nothing wrong. They oppress them. They make them work, work, work. Now Pharaoh is so fearful of them, he's willing to drown their babies. Not unlike what Herod will do in the book of Matthew in the New Testament, and trying to kill the infants in order to destroy the seed of the woman there. So again, we want to see these connections between the testaments. But now the camera focuses in on a particular family, a man and his wife. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. Okay, here there's so much action in just these 2 verses. First of all, it's a story of God's providence. This isn't by accident. God has purposed and planned the life of Moses. Moses is central to God's plan and his unfolding story of redemption. God is later going to prophesy that Jesus is going to be a prophet like unto Moses. So Moses is no accident. He's not just incidental. He is absolutely key to the story of God's redemptive purposes in history. He's going to tell us a lot about God's purpose and plan. So it's a story of God's providence. It's God's pre-mundane plan unfolding. But it's also a romance, isn't it? It does us well to remember that we're not fatalists. That we don't just say, oh, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. You know, this man of the tribe of Levi, he has to marry a wife. He doesn't just sit home. He has a romantic interest of one kind or another in this woman. He chooses her, or their families choose them for one another, but they have a marriage, and he knows her intimately. She conceives and bears a son. So even in the grand scheme of God's great redemptive plan, human beings have to do what human beings do. And they're not trying to figure out whether or not they're part of God's plan. They're living their lives. I think sometimes we waste a lot of time trying to discern whether or not we understand how we fit into God's great plan instead of just living our lives in the daily decisions of life, showing the fruit of the Spirit, living out the gospel, treating other people kindly. And in the living of our lives, God will make sure that what needs to happen will happen. We just simply, we need to make good decisions. We need to act on the revealed will of God that he has shown us in his word. And that's exactly what this man does. He marries a woman, she conceives, she bears a child, and when this child is born, she sees, the book of Hebrews says that he's a beautiful child. Here it says he's a fine child. Now, every mother would think this. Of course, every mother would think this. Those of you who've been at Buck Run long know my thing about I really don't think many newborn babies are pretty. Not for the first few hours or maybe the first few days. Now, they get pretty, but they're rarely pretty at birth. But to a mother, they are. And to this mom, she sees this little baby, and there's no way she's going to throw this baby into the Nile. Not in the way Pharaoh indicates anyway. She sees that he's a beautiful child, and she hides him. But can you imagine the difficulty of hiding a baby for 3 months? This isn't in a place where you have insulated walls. These are thin walls that people can hear through, and certainly others can know. And she doesn't know if somebody will rat her out. And so she's got to hide this baby and keep this baby quiet. And she does this for 3 months, but the time comes when he's growing and he's crying, and she can't hide him anymore. And in an act of both desperation and I would argue trust. Trust that somehow God is going to do what only God can do, and God's going to spare the life of this child. She comes up with this plan. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. So she coats it with a tarry substance that makes it somewhat waterproof so that it will float. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Now, it's quite possible that this was simply her plan to hide him for a while. Maybe this was away from people, and she could go down periodically and check on him. It's possible that her plan was for her daughter to check on him. We don't know. It's very possible that somehow the Lord just told her, let me take care of it. I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. We know this, that she believes that somehow her child is going to be spared through this act, because if she didn't, then she could have just simply obeyed the king's edict herself. She could have just put him in the Nile without the basket. She could have thought, if my child is going to die, let's do this quickly so he doesn't suffer long. That's not what she does. She's trusting the Lord to deliver him because she sees he's a beautiful child, and in her heart, she knows he's beautiful to the Lord. And verse 4, her sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So apparently she posed her daughter, the older sister, and we're not sure if this is the sister that later becomes famous in the book or another sister, but this is his older sister, and she's somewhere near there on the banks of the Nile, and she's watching what would happen to the child. Now, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. What an interesting thing you have now. Two daughters coming down to the river. One, a daughter of a slave, watching to see if her brother will live. The other, the daughter of the king, who has decreed that that young baby should die. Both of them at the same river. And God, in his sovereign purpose and plan, is going to work so that they both are involved in sparing the life of the child. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Now that is astounding in itself, that here's Pharaoh's daughter, and no doubt she has heard the fear, despite the hatred of the Israelites from her father and in his household from other Egyptians. She's certainly not immune to their prejudices, to their fears. But when she sees this baby, she knows immediately he's a Hebrew. Now, how does she know that? He's circumcised. This baby is circumcised. Egyptians aren't circumcised. This is the sign of the covenant. And when she sees that the baby is circumcised, she knows immediately this is one of those Hebrew babies. And she knows that this child is under a sentence of capital punishment, that he should be drowned. But she takes pity on him. And Moses' sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Notice the brilliance of Moses' sister, who supplies a solution. And in the solution, the way she says it assumes that Pharaoh's daughter is going to spare the child at least and keep him at best. And she says, shall I go call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you so you can keep the child? And of course, Pharaoh's daughter thinks that's a great idea. She said to her, go. So the girl went and called Moses' mother. And she says, look at this. But I just can't imagine what this mother and father thought when their daughter runs through the household and says, you're not going to believe this. Pharaoh's daughter has spared Moses, and she wants a Hebrew wet nurse to nurse the baby for her. And God, in his sovereign plan, spares Moses' life, puts him into the very household of the king who has sentenced him to death, and now gives him his mother, his own mother, to nurse him. He's going to grow up the son of Pharaoh's daughter, in a sense. He's going to have access to the riches and the security of Egypt. But he's going to be loved, cared for, and nursed by his own mother. And so the girl went and called the child's mother in verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you your wages. Now, here you have a little foresight, a foreshadowing, if you will, of what God's going to do when Israel leaves Egypt. Not only are they going to leave, Egypt is going to bestow wealth on them. They're going to go out with a high hand, the Bible says. They're going to plunder Egypt. And here you have now Pharaoh's daughter paying Moses' mother to do what every mother is happy to do, and that is to nurse and care for her own child. She said, you nurse him, I'll pay you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So apparently she cares for him until the time he is weaned. And this is probably 4 or 5 years old, maybe even older, because this was the way that they would have fed their children. First of all, it is cheap and accessible, and this would have been very common. And so she brings him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of water. Moses sounds like the Hebrew's got the same consonants as the Hebrew for to draw out. She said, because I drew him out of water, I'm going to name him Moses. Now, what is God doing? He's already putting in place here these themes that are going to be prominent in the rest of the book of Exodus. Exodus is the way out. He's going to use Moses, who is drawn out of the water, which is representative of Egypt, to draw his people out of Egypt and take them to the wilderness, where there he's going to purify them. He's going to give them his law and prepare them for the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses is going to be key in that. He's going to be the great lawgiver. What God is doing is he's laying down here in Exodus the themes that are going to be picked up in the New Testament. Jesus is the new Moses who, by the way, like Moses, how does he begin his ministry? He passes through the water. He's baptized of John, and he goes into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days, like Moses leads the Israelites into the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus, the new lawgiver, that's what the Sermon on the Mount is about. Jesus saying, you've heard it said, but I say to you, what's he doing? He's giving the new law. So it's so important that you read the Old Testament with New Testament eyes, that you see the old covenant that's going to be given here as leaning us forward to the new covenant that comes in Jesus Christ. You know, the Old Testament is a great story all by itself, but you can't be saved simply by staying in the Old Testament. You have to look through the Old Testament to the New. You have to look through Moses to see Jesus, because Jesus is the one who saves us. Moses can't save. He had to be saved himself, but Jesus is the one who saves. So as we begin our study in Exodus, man, we want to see it as new covenant believers, and yet it is so exciting to see how God uses this to shine a light on Christ, and that's what we anticipate and look forward to. So, Lord willing, I will see you again next Wednesday night or whenever you're watching this, and we'll pick up right there in verse 11 of Exodus chapter 2 as we see how God now uses Moses to deliver his people. God bless.